is part 2 of what I'm just going to call environment painting demo, but really this technique applies to any project we're going to be working on this semester. These are techniques that you can use going forward in Photoshop for basically anything, or in any other or raster imaging software you might be using. Something like GIMP or Procreate on an iPad, or anything that uses rasters to create art and has layers. So, okay, in the last part of this demo, I kind of talked about how to make selections and fill those selections with color. Instead of always having to use a paintbrush to apply color, you can make a selection and fill that. And sometimes you get a lot cleaner edges, and sometimes it's a lot quicker. And then I also talked about how to use layers to kind of isolate things and make things easy to edit and change. But now we're going to dive a little deeper into layers and how you can use them as part of your painting toolkit. Okay, so right now my illustration is basically a bunch of different layers on top of my sketch, and I went in and broke it all up into kind of groupings. Alright, so that's our fairly complete drawing there. But now we need the detail, and we need the painting part of things. Okay, now let's say I want to add some highlights here to this island area. I want to do some highlights, like sunlight coming in, hitting it. So what I would do normally is pick my color. If I were working traditionally, I'd pick a color and load my paintbrush up with it, and just go in and make sure I'm on that layer, which is island, and I'd go in and try to paint. Now, what's tricky is you get into the edge of the object, this being the island, right? And I want to paint that, but you know, the way it is right now, trying to go in and get stay just on the edge of that is near impossible, or it's really difficult with a mouse at the very least. So what I'm going to do is make that easier, where I can just go in and paint my highlights and not worry about going outside the lines. So here's what you can do in Photoshop when you have things set up in layers. On my layer palette, I'll go to the layer that I want to paint. In this case, it's island. I can turn it off, turn it back on, and make sure. Now what I can do is, as I hover the mouse over the thumbnail, if I hold down the option or the command key, you'll see the icon change. It's now the hand with this little rectangle selection icon. So what that means is, with the command key down, and that's on a Mac, it's either Control or one of those three keys there by the space bar on a PC. But if you hold down the command key on a Mac and click, you get a selection around your shape. So what that means then is you're only going to be painting inside the area that's selected. It's impossible to paint outside the selected area. So I've got my brush here. I can scribble and paint up here, down here, nothing happens. But as soon as I move into the selection and paint, it will paint. But it also keeps things from going outside the boundaries of that shape, right? Which is really nice, because then what you can do is you can go in and be a little looser with your painting and not have to worry so much about staying inside the lines. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get a brush and do my highlights, and I'll do a lower opacity just because it helps to mimic traditional media where you get some opacity and some texture. And I might pick a different brush and switch up my brushes a little bit. So maybe this pastel brush, but maybe drop that color down to 6% or 8%, and I might pick another color to give it a little more lightness here. I might go a little bit darker with a larger brush. darker there and increase my opacity. But what I'm doing is playing around with these settings for the opacity and the brush size to try to get some different looks. And kind of get some subtlety in here. And then, so what that gives me is now I've got this shape that I've been able to add light to and shadow to and give it texture and give it some definition. I might take the smudge brush now and go in and smudge that a little bit. That's pretty heavy, right? So I can undo that. And then I can turn the strength down on it up here at the top. Again, you'll have controls for all your brushes at the top. So you can change stuff up here. But now I can kind of play around and blend this together a little more in a more textured way. So now I've got something that looks like it's akin to a painting. Now what I forgot to do there, that I want to also kind of show you and remind you of, is that normally I like to work on a layer on top of it for highlights. So here I've done that previously. Okay, so what happens is, let me just show you this. This is the island, that's the object I want to select. I'll go in and again command click that to make that a selection. I can create a new layer on my layer palette, make sure it's above the layer with the island, and then it will keep this selection, right? And so then what I can do is I can go in and just paint on top of that. Okay, and so you can see a little bit better maybe what it's doing here. So still I'm working on a new layer, but that selection will maintain until you go in and deselect it. So, but that's a way you can kind of play around and not have to be concerned with getting outside the lines and having a messy painting. It just gives you a lot of good control over what you're trying to accomplish here. Then I'll turn this on underneath, and I can blend that some more. Then again, I can use my layer modes here to change how that interacts with what's underneath. That's pretty good. I like that because it gives you a nice rich yellow here, but it's a little intense. So I'll just back that off a little bit on the opacity of this particular layer. So that's really a technique you can use on any of these layers. Like we've got this yellow sky layer, I can select that in the same way, command click on a Mac, either control or alt click on a PC, I think. Just try one of those three until that icon switches. But I can make a selection there. Then I can get my brush, and let's say I want to do kind of like a sunset here. And make sure you're on the right layer. So here's my sky layer. I'll create a new layer on top of that. And I'll maybe get a bigger brush so I can make it a little smoother and then take the opacity down some. So I can go in and start to put in some detail in the sky here. And I can do some lighter areas up here. I just play around and get a lot of different looks. So if I like that, I've got that layer on top. And there we go. Something else I could do is, instead of painting that with a paintbrush, go ahead and delete that layer. And the way to delete a layer is select it and click on the trash can, or drag it to the trash can. And let's create a new layer, and I'm going to select my sky again. And you've got this gradient tool in Photoshop. Okay, so you select the gradient tool, click up here at the top, you'll have different kind of gradients you can select. So this is that I want kind of an orange yellow sunset, and so here in I think it's in the orange folder is an orange red. So you just click on the one you want to use. The way it works is you have a starting color and an ending color, left to right here. So the starting color is yellow. what I have to do to apply this gradient is click. Once I've got my gradient tool, click to start the gradient. That's the starting color. And then drag as far as I want to drag that to the end. And so it blends those colors in between. And what happens is it's dependent on how long that drag line is. If I just barely drag it, that creates this really quick transition between the two colors. If I drag it out further, it's a much more subtle transition. So that's important to do or to know so you can kind of control the degree of the gradient. Like if I want more yellow at the top, maybe I'll start the yellow inside the selection. You can also do it at an angle. You can also pick a circular gradient. So back up at the top, if you click the second one here, that'll be a gradient from the first color to the second color in a radial pattern. So you might want to try something like that. And like even with the water, we could do kind of a similar thing. I can do it. I'm going to create a new layer just because I like to protect things. I'm going to select that water, go to my gradients, and maybe do something like that. But probably, no, that's not too bad. Now that's a little intense and I want to blend it a little more, so again I've got my layer, so maybe I'll back off that a little bit and get a little more subtlety into it. And maybe I'll, that's a kind of a nice blend from that blue to the greenish, so I like that, so I'll stay with that. So that's a way you can use these layers to make selections to protect areas when you're trying to do your painting. It's a really handy thing to know how to do and to get used to using that. And again, this is kind of an introductory technique. The better you learn to control this kind of stuff and do this, the better you're going to get with Photoshop. And you'll start to use these techniques in much more complex ways to create much more complex artwork. Something you do want to do is when you get to the end of this assignment. Oh no, I got a couple other things I want to show you. We'll do that first. Okay, so one of the problems is there is a problem when you're working in layers like this, where you're doing these flat colors, is, we talked about how you can use the layer mode, change that to multiply, and get your drawing to come through. Okay, and so we could do the same with the water layer. So I'm getting my sketches to come through, right? Now that works fine when you've got one layer with color. But what happens is when you have multiple layers with solid color, is they start to interact in really weird ways when you start changing the layer mode. So let's take this grass area here. I want to get the detail coming through, right? Normal, I can't see it. If I change to multiply, that works, but what happens is you'll see down here, now it's interacting not just with this background, but also with the two layers underneath it. And it's starting to look kind of weird. You could probably make that work, but now if we try to do the same thing with the dinosaur to get that detail, if I change that to multiply, then it starts to stack color on top of color and you get unpredictable results. Right? So when you're using this technique, you've got to change things up a little bit. You want to keep all of these main flat layers in their normal mode. Okay, you don't want to have them blend and interact underneath. But how do you get your sketches and your details from that? Let's see. What you would do is, so down at the bottom you've got your background layer. That's the layer with all your sketch work, your line work, whatever. What you want to do is click on it with your left mouse button and drag it to this little square with the plus sign. That will make a copy of the background layer. Then you want to click on that background copy hold down the button and drag it up to the very top. And so you then put it on top of everything else. Okay? Now you can't see through it, right, because it's solid. But we know that the multiply layer will cause this to blend in with the layers underneath. So then we can go to multiply, and we're back to having our sketch. Okay? What that does, it just puts that sketch on the top layer so you can have the bottom layer interact the way you want it to interact. Okay, so that's something to kind of keep in mind. But then you can turn on all your different paint effects and everything, and kind of get this back to the way you want it to be. But you can see all of your pencil detail, and you can still then go in and work on parts underneath. So if I wanted to do a little shading on the dinosaur, I might go into a new layer and do black. Select a dark black for that, and kind of shade her a little bit. Maybe do a larger, the lower opacity, and maybe even pick a different brush. But I like to blend my brushes too. Get a lot of different effects by using different brushes. So play around with those. And that gives it a nice, like this textured skin almost. And I'm just kind of clicking instead of clicking and dragging to use that brush. Now I may have overshot it a little bit. That may be a little too much, but I know because I'm on my own layer here, I can select the layer, take the opacity, and drop it down some, so it's not quite so prominent. And then again, I can also still change the way it interacts. Now what I like about this is I can do that and get this kind of shift in the color. Instead of just that dark purple, it becomes a little more of a darker blue. And so that's a nice way to add some subtle color variations in your work that you might not otherwise think to do. Okay, so hopefully that helps. Now, here's the final step you want to do is, let's say you're finished with your drawing and you got all your layers, and that creates a really large document in terms of memory size. What you can do is, by combining layers, you can shrink the document size down and make it work a little faster, and then what you turn into me is going to be a lot more streamlined. So let's say this is the way I want it. It's finished. I'm going to save it. Okay. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to flatten all of these layers into one single layer. Once I do that, I can't go back and edit them individually, which I might want to do at a later date. So what I'll do is I'll go in and do a file and do a save as, and I'm calling this one EnvironDemoPart1, and I'll just call it flat, and hit save and hit OK. Then what I'll do is I'll flatten all of these layers into one single layer. Go to layer, and down to the bottom, flatten image, and discard hidden layers, yes. And now I've got one single background image. Okay, I can't edit anything without going in and just painting over the top of it, but I have saved it, because I saved it as a version of it called flat. I saved a new copy of it with all the layers removed. Then, like something like this, where I have a border, but I've kind of got some places that are outside the border, what I want to do is crop that. So I'll get the cropping tool, and up at the top here, this sets your window size, and if you just pick ratio, it lets you draw a custom size out. And then once you've got it cropped the way you want it, you can double click it, and you've got a nice clean illustration without those kind of crazy outside edges. So hopefully you find this tutorial helpful. Again, it's just about increasing your knowledge of the basic Photoshop tools and how to use those basic tools to make your work more effective and really make your workflow much more fluid and fun for you, I think. So you have to spend a little time up front really getting the hang of these. But once you learn them, you will always know how to use them, and you don't have to think about it anymore. It becomes instinctive. And then you just get to do the fun part of just, the actual painting or the creative decision making. All right, so then I would save this. And then I would also do File, Save As. For me, you would upload a JPEG of that. So you go to File, Save As, and pick it as a JPEG, and save that. So you end up with a couple copies. One still has all the layers if you want to go back and change something later. One is the flattened Photoshop document, and then one is just a less memory JPEG file. All right, hopefully that helps.